With us today is Stephen Yoch, who will discuss his latest book, Becoming Benedict Arnold, and examine the differences and similarities between Arnold and his mentor, George Washington. His love of history and writing compelled him to pick up his pen and tell the little-known stories behind the people that founded the Republic. He's enjoyed over 3 decades of practicing law in the Twin Cities. He represents different businesses on corporate matters, mergers, and real estate matters. He's been named a super lawyer for 25 years and is recognized by Chambers USA. He's also involved in his family's branded content business. He apparently does not sleep. Steve and his wife, Andrea, have 2 fantastic sons who finished college and have left the nest. In his free time, he enjoys supporting the Minnesota Aurora, the new community-owned women's soccer team led by his wife and a group of founders. So let's give a warm, welcoming introduction to Stephen Yoch.
Thanks. Thank you. It's great. I was here 8 years ago, which is about how long it takes me to research and write my books. So I don't know if a PowerPoint's going to come up here at some point, but I'll just start talking. So I'm going to talk about Benedict Arnold and a little bit about George Washington too. And there are on your tables bookmarks about my book, which leads you to my website, which you can learn more if you have questions. I love questions at the end if we have time. One of the reasons I was telling Debbie that I like Rotary so much is it's always a very knowledgeable group about history. So I love the questions. And we're going to talk today about George and Benedict. And it's a story of 2 patriots. People always think of George, of course, as a patriot, as he was. But Benedict Arnold was also one of our greatest patriots until, of course, he became our greatest traitor. But that's why he was such a big deal. One of the things people forget is that George Washington, before he was a patriot, he was a loyalist toady. He wanted nothing more than in the French and Indian War, which is what my first book is about, is to be a British military officer. That's all he ever wanted, right? And if you look at Benedict Arnold, he started out as the ultimate rebel scum, right? And became a loyalist toady at the end. And one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about stuff like this because I'm very odd. And we good? No? All right, so these are both paintings of both George and Benedict. This is from the French and Indian War with George as a colonel. And of course, this is we can talk about it later. These are both painted by the same guy. And this is George after the Battle of Princeton, where he becomes just our perfect rebel scum. So the question I always have is, I think about this. What are you? What am I? What would we have done in the revolution? Would we have been loyalists or rebels? Now, this is the Yoch test. Since I made it up, I can call it what I want. And whether or not I think you'd be a loyalist or a rebel turns to some extent on, are you a rule follower? If you're a rule follower, you'd probably have been a loyalist, right? Do you benefit from the current political and economic system? If so, probably a loyalist. Have you ever participated in anti-government protests of any kind? If not, if you have, you probably would be a rebel scum. My wife, as Laura noted, is the head of the Minnesota Aurora women's soccer team, and she's much cleverer than I am. So she has different questions. One is, do you like to get to the airport early? If you like to get to the airport early, then you're probably a loyalist. If seats are open at a ball game and you're in your seats and there's seats up front, will you move towards those seats? If you will, you are rebel scum. And finally, if there's a long line of people, is your first instinct to get in line or to try to figure out a way to get around the line? And if it's to get around the line or to get in line, that means you're probably a loyalist. We're going to talk about that later, and it's an important concept, I think, to understand these 2 guys. But let's compare these 2 patriots. A lot of people have asked me, because I'm a nerd and people ask me questions like this, who was the greatest general? Was it George or was it Benedict? Now, I recognize these are them as colonels, but I like these paintings better. And it's Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was our greatest battlefield commander. He was a tactical genius. He was crazy brave. It is no contest. Benedict Arnold was arguably the best battlefield commander in general on either side of the war. And he was indispensable to American victory. If he had not won several of the battles he won, we would never have gotten our independence. Who was our greatest leader? No contest, right? George Washington. He was and is always often called the indispensable founding father. Who was our greatest hero? Until his treachery, a lot of people would have said Benedict Arnold at the time if you'd asked him. So my question was, why? Right? How do you go from becoming our greatest general to our greatest traitor? Right? How do you explain the differences? I'm interested, hence the name of my books, how you become Benedict Arnold, how you become George Washington. What happens that makes you go down that divergent path? There's part of me that would like to say, well, these are just opposite guys, right? They're just completely different. But let's look at their childhoods first and see what we find. And first of all, the question is, do they have loving and supportive fathers, right? Let's compare the two. We know the George Washington story, right? The cherry tree story, Father, I Cannot Tell a Lie, the story by Parson Weems. The problem is it's a lie. It was made up after George died. And it's wrong because George was not close to his dad. It's not that his dad was a bad guy. It's just he died when George was 11. He traveled a lot, and George really never knew him. So he did not have a close relationship with his father. Benedict's father was accomplished when Benedict was very young, but he literally became a drunken wharf rat. And so Benedict was never close to his father. Loving and supportive mothers. Well, you know, a lot of times, like the presidents, like FDR and Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, right? They have these sometimes smothering but definitely supportive mothers, and that helped move them along. How about that? Not true for these guys. My favorite story about this is George Washington. They never got along. He fought with his mother his entire life. She did not go to his wedding, and she could have gone. She did not go to his inauguration, and she could have gone. In fact, I would say George spent most of his life trying to escape his mother. In fact, my first book really is a lot of him trying to avoid her. Arnold did have a loving and pious mother, but she was kind of a weak person, and she died when he was relatively young, and he was just never close to her. So, okay, so they have sort of similar areas there. How about educations, world-class educations? Both of them, by the time they were in 8th grade, had to leave because of lack of money. Coincidentally, both in 8th grade. But Washington was a wealthy planter, right? So he had that going for him, right? He had Mount Vernon. Again, not true. It was his brothers. By the way, it was called Eppenvossen, but it was renamed with a much better name, Mount Vernon. George would not get it until much later in his life. So he grew up middling gentry with not very much money at all. And of course, as you gather from Arnold, he initially had money, but then fell into poverty later, and by the time his father passed away. So what do you got? You got two guys with no real relationships with their fathers. Neither were close to their mothers. Both Arnold and Washington were pulled out of school by the time they were 14. Washington became a surveyor, which was a respected profession, but he was a hardworking guy. Arnold was made an indentured servant, which sounds bad, but actually he was kind of in the merchant class, and it was a very good indentured servitude. So they're both hardworking, industrious, and successful men, young men. And so, yeah, George has got some mom issues, and maybe Benedict's got some dad issues, but for the most part, they had kind of a parallel life up until their early manhood. So I thought, well, let's look at friends and mentors, right? And George was really good at connecting with people. Most importantly, people above him in the social strata, the Fairfaxes, by the way, Fairfax County, Virginia, the Fairfaxes, largest landowners in Virginia and the Ohio country. Lord Fairfax and Colonel Fairfax really took him under his wing. This is Belvoir, their mansion, which is, by the way, now a military base near D.C., and because we took over it when the Revolution started because they were loyalists. But they were very close to him. And this is his brother Lawrence. If you go to George's study in Mount Vernon today, you'll see this painting. This is of his brother Lawrence in a military uniform. And George said during his lifetime, if there was a fire, this would be the only thing he would take out of the house. Lawrence was 12 years older than George. His half-brother from his dad's first marriage, the wife died. Gus, his father, remarried, and George is the oldest of 6. But Lawrence really became his surrogate father and really taught him how to be a gentleman. And George spent much of his life trying to emulate Lawrence. The other thing George was really good at is connecting with people in authority above him, in particular generals in the French and Indian War, who he learned what to do and not to do. This is a very famous painting at the time. This is the Battle of Monongahela, and here's George. Remember that uniform earlier? This is that he's standing on a horse, and there's General Braddock getting shot by the evil French and Indians, who would later be our allies in the next war, but let's not quibble. And every single officer was shot or killed in this battle except George Washington. And he led a really brave retreat, saved the army. And until the revolution, if you ask someone who George Washington was, they would say the hero of the Monongahela. So George really learned a lot from his mentors. Let's compare that with Benedict. And I think now we begin to see where the differences happen. While they gave him a great deal of help after his indentured servitude, there's no indication of ongoing correspondence. Now, it's a little of an issue with Benedict than it wasn't with George, because when Benedict committed his treason, everybody burned every letter they had from Benedict, right? No one wanted a letter from Benedict Arnold in their house. But we don't see any indication that he really kept a relationship with them, even though they were very kind to him. And a lot of his friends turned out to be not great friends. This is Silas Deane. If you're a real nerd, you know Silas was one of the early revolutionaries, was in the Sons of Liberty and went to the constitutional conventions, or the Continental Congresses. But he fell out of disrepute and actually was one of Benedict's closest friends, but he would die in exile during the revolution and be totally disheartened by the revolution. And yet they were close, so he was always sort of whispering in Benedict's ear against the revolution. Philip Schuyler, by the way, if you're a Hamilton fan, this is Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. I think more importantly, the father of Eliza Schuyler, who I think is the hero of Hamilton. He early on was a mentor of George's, but he fell out of favor during the revolution because of politics. Schuyler later re-engaged after the revolution and became a senator from New York, but Benedict was also just unlucky. Sometimes he would find benefactors who would fall out of power. And he was not a good read of people. This is Horatio Gates, who was a horrible guy, who initially pretended to be Benedict's friend, but became jealous of what I'll be describing later, his spectacular military successes, and essentially turned on him and started a whispering campaign against Benedict. So again, he didn't always choose the right people to be his friends. And then George Washington. George was Benedict's mentor. George is 15 years older than Benedict. And George had to make some decisions about what to do with Benedict, and one of the things he did is he moved him to Philadelphia after he had been severely wounded at the Battle of Saratoga. It would be the worst decision George ever made in his career. And also, sometimes George could not support Benedict because of the political fights within the revolution that I'll talk about in a second. So what you have in life, given these mentors and friends, we all deal with rejection and frustration. Everyone faces them. But I think the influence here of clearly the families didn't make a difference, but the influence of mentors and the characters revealed in those crucibles of adversity. And my first book talks a lot about this, about George. You know, he's the hero of the Monongahela. Starting from age 21 to 27, he would lead the entire Virginia military. So for 7 years, when he's only like mid-20s, he's leading the entire military, and all he wanted in life was a royal commission, right? Because he's just a militia colonel. So he goes to meet this guy, Lord Loudon. Lord Loudon is the head of the British military at that time, and he makes George wait in his outer office for 2 weeks in Philadelphia because George is asking for this commission. And when George finally is brought in, Loudon dresses him down, calls him a mere provincial, an uneducated fop, and tells him to go back and do his duty, and completely humiliates George. Well, George does get mad, by the way. He never forgets, and he would always believe later on in a meritocracy. But George's result is he looks forward, right? He ends up running for the House of Burgesses while he's still in the military uniform, does a lot of other things to look forward in life. In contrast, Benedict, by the way, you'll get a sense of how successful he was. He helped capture Fort Ticonderoga, which, by the way, the cannons there were then later allowed us to win in Boston. He led a brave attack on Quebec. He was the admiral of Valcour Island, which saved the revolution, built an entire navy, and fought the British to a standstill. He repulsed attack on Connecticut, and he was the hero of Saratoga. So severely wounded at Saratoga, George sends him, as I said, to Philadelphia, and he meets this guy, who I think is one of the most reprehensible people in the Revolution. He was on George's staff and betrayed Washington. He is an ultra-radical, and a lot of people think of the Revolution as sort of like a monolith, but it wasn't. You had the military under George. It was kind of the conservatives. And on the other side, you had the radicals. And the radicals were very concerned that, as in most revolutions, if we managed to win, which was not a sure thing, but if we managed to win, then there will be a dictatorship to follow. Because this is the guy that they were all afraid of. Does anybody know who this is? Anyone take a guess? This is Oliver Cromwell. And we forget because that was only about 80 years before our revolution. Oliver Cromwell, they'd had the British Civil War, and Oliver Cromwell at the end declares himself what? Lord Protector of England for life, right? And by the way, that's what happens. Take any example, Kim Jong-un, Castro, Napoleon, Lord Protector here. If you win, you make yourself king, Lord Protector, or president for life. That's what you do. I try to stay out of current politics, but that is the fear, right? And so Joseph Reed was a particularly reprehensible guy. One of his favorite things to do was to hang Quakers. But they had this fear that George would take over at the end, and his henchman was Benedict Arnold. So we're going to go after the guy who's in town. Benedict got really mad, and Benedict went to the dark side, right? Unlike George, who looked forward, Benedict looked for revenge. And part of that is to understand how these two behave differently under stress is the impact of a good spouse. This is Martha Custis Washington. This is the earliest painting of Martha. This is right before she married George. We're used to seeing Martha, old with the funny hat. Martha was not a looker. Even the descriptions then at the time was she was not a looker. However, Martha was the wealthiest widow in Virginia. And she needed someone to help run her many plantations, and George needed money. The nice thing to know about George and Martha is George writes a letter to a young woman much later in life and says, marry for sound reasons, love will come. Martha was the most important relationship in his life. George, when he married her, would be corresponding with her when he was out in the field, and generally a lot, where he would vent his anger. He had a very temper he had a hard time controlling because he had an awful mother who gave him that temper. And they talked about her soothing effect, and she counseled patience and understanding. We don't know that. We hear that inferentially because when George died, Martha burned all their correspondence. And many believe to protect George. In particular, her impact, I think, is on this date, December 23rd, 1783. I believe this is the most important date in early American history, not July 4th. This is the day George Washington, after winning the Revolution, returns his commission to Congress. He went to Annapolis, and there's George handing it to a bunch of people in the painting, by the way, who were not there. But most importantly, who's up in the gallery? The lady with the funny hat, right? And that's Martha. Martha encouraged him to do this. And by the way, he meant it, right? He then went back to Mount Vernon for 7 years, then became president, really didn't want to be president. And this electrified the world, right? I mean, no one does this, right? The radicals were wrong, but just because we were lucky enough to have George Washington. Let's talk about the other spouse. Let's talk about Peggy Shippen Arnold. So Benedict is in a lot of pain from the wounds. He gets sent to this cesspool that is Philadelphia with the radicals. They're attacking him all the time. And he meets this lovely young woman, Peggy Arnold, and she is a loyalist. And while Martha is always counseling patience and understanding, she is introducing him to this guy, Major John Andre, who is the head of the British spy network that she had met when the British had been in Philadelphia. Now, I'm not saying that Peggy was responsible for Arnold being a traitor. She was a major contributor. So was, frankly, George not standing by him as the radicals were attacking him. It's always a series of things that lead you down the dark path. So mentors, friends, and spouses made a difference for these two patriots, right? And we can see by now kind of how they ended up. They might have sounded similar, but they went down different paths. This is a long quote, but this is by Nathaniel Greene, who was one of Washington's leading officers and did the orders of the day when his treachery was discovered. Since the fall of Lucifer, nothing has equaled the fall of Arnold. His military reputation in Europe and America was flattering to the vanity of the first general of his age. He will now sink as low as he had been high before, and as the devil made war upon heaven after his fall, so I expect Arnold will fall upon America. Should it ever fall in our hands, he will be sweet sacrifice. Meanwhile, George Washington, in his lifetime, is called the father of our country, and that moment when he turns in his resignation to Congress, George III heard that he had done it, and he said, if he did that, he's the greatest man in the world. Right? He thought it was a joke, because nobody does that. Okay, so now we know all this background, how you end up. The question is, are you a loyalist toady or are you a rebel scum? Okay, now, remember the test. Okay, take a second and look at the test. I'm not going to make you raise your hand yet, but I will, so just be ready. But I'm going to make a confession first, that I am a loyalist toady who wishes to be a rebel scum. I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, and every single, on that test, every single one, I'm a loyalist. My wife's or mine, I can't help it. And this is at my book release party, and so what I did is I had a shirt made. That's my wife and my boys, and by the way, there's Benedict and there's George. And I had a shirt made that was half Stars and Stripes and half Union Jack, because I wish I could be a rebel, but I'm a loyalist at heart. But what are you? Well, first of all, don't feel bad. So when the war started, about 25% were loyalists, about 25% rebel, and about 50% were either undecided or didn't care, just wanted to be left alone, right? By the way, that percentage varied by location. So in the South, it was a much higher percentage loyalist. If you were up in New England, it was a much higher rebel. And over time, the rebel percentage would increase. But this is a huge decision, right? Because like if you look at William and Benjamin Franklin, those were father and son split for life on this decision. Your neighbors could become your enemies. Fratricide was part of it. And when I ask you to raise your hands in a second, look around, because that was what people forget is the American Revolution was a civil war. And so it was a huge decision. So given my test, those of you that are with me and that you're loyalist toadies, raise your hands. Come on, it's okay. Everybody's got to raise their hand one way or another. You can't be undecided. All right. The rest of you, like my wife, if you're a rebel scum, raise your hand. And that's good too. The good news is for all of us, it worked out either way. Either way, we have an amazing history, and I'm glad the rebels won, by the way, and that we loyalists didn't prevail. So I've got a few minutes, and I really do enjoy, oops, I went the wrong way. I really do enjoy questions. So Revolution, George, Benedict, anything you want, yeah.
More of a comment than a question, but at the Battle of Kings Mountain, on the statue honoring the place where the battle was fought, one of the dead is Lieutenant John Beatty, a rebel, my great whatever grandfather. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that it was a civil war. I'm sure you already know at that particular battle there was only one Englishman there, but on the mountainside we had no problem shooting Englishmen.
Well,
been doing it our entire lives. We're just keeping it up.
Well, I'm going to choose this as an opportunity for a plug for my next book. My next book is called Becoming Victorious. It's about from the fall of Charleston to victory at Yorktown, which is and it was fought all through the Carolinas, and it was unbelievable. We were outnumbered 10-1. George has just lost his greatest general, and he has to send a bunch of ragtag guys down there, and it's an inconceivable story with unbelievable battles, including there. So that's my next book, which is fun. Yeah. Go ahead, knows you, yeah.
It sounds like the whole future could have been different if George would have maintained contact with Benedict. And I'm wondering, did George just get super busy? Was there a falling out? Do you know what kind of transpired?
Yeah, so there's, by the way, I've written an article about this that said if Benedict Arnold had succeeded in his treason, we'd all be speaking German. The other half is there are a million points. I always viewed Benedict's treason as like a plane crash. Any one of these things, for example, if he had never met Peggy Arnold, would he have become a traitor? If he had fallen in love with a woman in Boston who had rebuffed him, but what if she hadn't? She, by the way, was a rebel. He had asked to be put in the Navy after he got hurt because he couldn't move. What if George had said yes to that? Any one of those things, I think there'd be cities called Arnold or Benedict in his honor, right? It is a series of events, right? And George thought he was giving him a posh deal. He'd get to stay in a fancy house, he could sit around, he could recuperate. George didn't understand the political implications. And then once they started, he couldn't fight the powerful state of Pennsylvania, that he needed their support. And so he left Benedict out to dry. So that's part of why he became a rebel, yeah.
I'm kind of thinking back to the Culler's biography of John Adams, or even the biography of General Joseph Warren, but weren't there kind of hybrid folks in those days who, pre-1776, we kind of thought, well, we'll fight so we don't have taxation without representation, but at some point we'll make nice with England and they'll give us more autonomy, but we'll still be loyal subjects.
Yeah, I mean, the most people thought after when they had the first Continental Convention, they really still hoped that they could have a rapprochement. And there were people in New England who had crossed that line a lot earlier. John Adams, by the way, was more aggressive. For example, Washington, interestingly, was more aggressive. But there were those in the South, and especially those from New York, that tended to be much more, we can work out a deal, it'll be fine, just give us some autonomy. You know, by the way, I feel sorry for the Brits. They had just paid for the French and Indian War, which is what this book is about. And they almost went broke paying for the French and Indian War for America so it could be free and not be subject to French encroachment. And then suddenly they're like, hey, we need you to pay your way a little bit. We're almost broke. We need you to pay some taxes. The only mistake they didn't ask us to pay, right? If they had asked us to throw some money in, maybe we would have done it. But instead, we end up resisting to pay for a war that gave us the ability to expand all the way out to the Mississippi. So kind of a bad deal for the Brits. And there was a lot of people that hoped we could have had a rapprochement. And by the way, by the end of this book, there's just something called the Carlisle Commission that's in America that's basically giving us everything we want. But by then, it's too late. We've crossed the Rubicon. We're gonna fight to the end. Any other questions? Go ahead, yeah.
I actually have an idea for you. You could do your book electronic and you could give like those 3 different scenarios and they could pick their
Yeah, no, so I did have fun writing the alternate history if Benedict succeeded. And it, by the way, it's this close. If Benedict had succeeded, and it's, okay, for those of you that remember the show Newhart with Bob Newhart? Anyone? Okay, Larry, Daryl, my other brother Daryl, okay? They basically capture Major John Andre. And if those idiots had not captured Major John Andre, the entire course of American history would be different, right? And including, I really do think that we could have ended up speaking German. It is amazing to think how our history could be different, just a few things changed.
Doesn't this kind of tie in a little bit too with that big debate over the great man theory of history? Do the times, does somebody come to the fore, or is, like, say in Ireland when Daniel O'Connell had a they found out he had an affair and a father and a child and put Irish history back 70 years ago, that one little happenstance in terms of who rises to the top and for what reason could change the course of history for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I think one really interesting thing about George in my first book, George got smallpox as a young man, visiting Barbados with his brother to try to help him not die from tuberculosis. That sterilized George. So George never had any children. Martha had 2 children from his first marriage, so we know she was fertile, and they got married at 27, so she definitely was of age. And he could never have children. What if he had had a son, right? And Alexander Hamilton was whispering in his ear and saying, you can be king. George was the father of our country because he was the father of no one, because he got smallpox as a young man and was sterilized, right? Those sort of things. Now, as a result, it allowed George to be able to willingness to give up power and to be the great man on December 23rd, 1783. But would he have done that the same way if he had a son? I don't know. I mean, George did a lot of weird stuff. I mean, he did over Martha's objections, free all his slaves upon Martha's death, right? So George was a big thinker, but he might have been thinking differently in his son. So I think it is interesting. George was certainly a pivotal figure in world history, but George could have been a very different guy under different circumstances.
You said that if he'd succeeded, we'd be speaking German. Can you explain?
All right, it's a little long, but I can do it quickly. Okay. If Benedict had succeeded, then George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton all would have been captured along with West Point, which would have cut the British off British would have then controlled the Hudson Valley and cut New England off from the rest of the war. Without George Washington, I think, and at that time, the Carlisle Commission was there. So without George, I think the rest of the country the army would have collapsed, and they would have accepted the offer of the Carlisle Commission. We would have come back into the fold. We would have had greater representation, blah, 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 but we would be part of the British Commonwealth again. The British Commonwealth based its structure on keeping its colonies relatively agrarian and non-industrial and tended to retard their growth. So we probably would not have grown as much. Also, they would have limited our westward expansion it would have happened, but it would have been slower. We may not have done the Louisiana Purchase because they wouldn't want to give the money to the French. So our westward expansion would have been greatly slowed down. We would not have been the industrial power we wanted. When slavery inevitably came more, the British tended to believe in partition. Look at India and Pakistan. So again, slower industrial growth. The First World War was inevitable, which it is. So we would have supplied the troops. We still probably, then the Brits still would have won the First World War. However, we would not have had the industrial base because we wouldn't have grown as much to provide the arsenal of democracy. Therefore, the Germans, who, by the way, probably would have had more development time because they would have done better in the First War, would likely have won World War II. And then if they won World War II, we probably would have gone with the Germans, and so we'd all be speaking German. That is like my, okay, so I have the article's been published in a lot of newspapers. You can read it, but that's the what do you call it? The auctioneer version of it. I did as quickly as I could. Okay, and again, I spend time thinking about weird stuff. I think I'm out of time unless I'm out of time. So, by the way, I just got to make a plug. My book's available in all formats, including audiobooks, if you like audiobooks. And I'm here if I have some books if anybody wants to buy a book. So that's what I got. Thank you very much.